Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're starting chapter 8, which is the genetics of behavior. Sorry, my eyes are a little bit irritated today. Ugh, not sure if it's allergies or what. But anyways, the genetics of behavior. So we're going to be talking about behavioral genetics, and we are going to be focusing on sections 1 and 2. Section 1 is genes and behavior, and section 2 starts looking at some sleep disorders. All right, so you guys ready? Great, let's go. Genes contribute to most behavioral traits. So until recently, studies on behavior were limited to empiric risk estimates and adaptive and twin studies. Now remember, we were talking about those in chapter 7, and what they were looking at is trying to figure out certain behavioral traits and behavioral disorders and seeing how, if there's any kind of genetic component or if they were all environmentally based. And until, like they said recently, it was all based on observational data. But now with using SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, and looking at SNP patterns, we can actually use SNPs to correlate with disease symptoms. So that means that we can use these SNPs, which are specific loci are in the DNA, and find genes that are associated with these different behaviors and disorders. Candidate genes for behavior control are being sought among genes that control neurotransmission and signal transduction. So a neurotransmitter, it's the chemical messengers that go from one nerve cell to another in your neural network. So when you're feeling happy, it's because you have certain chemical signals going from one nerve cell to the other to pass on the signal of be happy or things like that. And there's a lot of neurotransmitters that affect our behavior. And as such, they're right now trying to scope out and determine where the genes for these particular neurotransmitters are and how they could be related to our behaviors as well as behavioral disorders. Most behavior problems are polygenic and multifactorial. So what that means is that there are multiple genes involved as well as some environmental components. Because of the complexity and plasticity of human behavior, caution must be exercised in assigning a genetic cause to a behavior. What we mean by that is humans like to label things, but a lot of times those labels have negative connotations. So if you label someone as having a particular behavioral disorder, it can follow them through school, which by itself won't necessarily be a bad thing because it means that we can be aware of it and work with the kid or the child in school to help them be successful. However, there's a lot of stigma in our society about different behavioral disorders. And that's the part that we're worried about by saying that you act this way because of this gene, then is that stigma ever going to leave you? And that's kind of what we're concerned about right now. So let's talk a little bit about some examples. Now, when we talk about behavioral disorders, we're not just talking about, like behavioral defiance disorders. What we're talking about is anything that affects the way that you feel, act, or perceive the world around you. So all of these here are examples of behavioral disorders, because all of these will affect the way that we act, the way that we feel, and the way that we view the world around us or even view ourselves. Phobias, which are fears, now the thing about phobias is that they are irrational fears. Sometimes they can be caused by a childhood trauma or something, but sometimes they just are. Like there's agoraphobia, which is fear of the outside world, and that anxiety that comes from having that phobia causes people to just live as hermits in their home. They don't want to go outside. It causes them too much fear and too much anxiety and can lead to panic attacks. There's fear of the color yellow. I don't really remember what that one is called. But like I said, a lot of these are irrational. It may be rooted in something associated with the neurotransmission when we view certain things, but they're called irrational fears for a reason, and judging someone on their phobias is not the best way to help them deal with it. Anxiety, that's actually becoming one of the more common ones. I want to common, not so much in that everyone has it, but we're seeing a lot more cases of it because of different things in our society. So we're seeing a lot of situational or environmentally based anxiety right now. Just like genetic causes, they still need to be treated. It's okay to need to treat them. Dementia is when you start losing a lot of your mental faculties. You might become confused more easily, forget people from your past, forget things like who your kids are or who you're married to, kind of like Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is a particular form of dementia. Psychosis is a lot more so like when you start acting what people would call crazy. So to an outsider, it just looks like you lost your mind, you're acting completely irrational, you're not making any sense. But to someone who suffers from a psychosis, it makes sense because of their perception of the world around them. Addiction, so the dependency and tolerance of different substances or other things, even gambling addiction, because a lot of times, whether it's addiction to a substance like alcohol or drugs, or addiction to gambling, it's based on the release of different neurotransmitters that give you that feeling of euphoria. And that's why people want to keep using or doing whatever it is that they're addicted to. Mood alteration or mood disorders such as depression, bipolar, we actually will talk a little bit about those ones later. But again, they affect how you feel, which will then affect how you act. Schizophrenia, which is a disorder where it affects the person's perception around them. And these are just to name a few. There's a lot more as well. There's a lot of different ones. When we talk about behavioral disorders and behavioral genetics, since it does discuss and deal with anything that affects how you act, how you think, how you feel, how you perceive the world around you, that actually does encompass quite a lot. All right, so let's move on. The first example is eating disorders. So we do have some examples which we'll get into, but first let's just talk very broadly about them. Eating disorders, we all know some examples, but this is when either you eat too much, you eat too little. It's some kind of perception of you and your body and you overcompensating by changing your diet. That is a very simplistic way to think about it. Just the best way I can think of right now without talking about the examples. Now, they have done twin studies with eating disorders, and what they found is that there is a strong concordance between monozygotic twins, stronger with the monozygotic twins than with the dizygotic twins. So what that means is that if one identical twin has an eating disorder, it is very likely that the second one will also develop an eating disorder. It's a lot more likely to occur in identical twins than it is in fraternal twins. And that tells us that there is some kind of genetic component involved, that it's not all environmentally based. Although, full disclaimer, with every single one of these behavioral disorders, there are genetic versions, which is the ones we're focusing on in this chapter, but there actually are completely 100% environmentally based ones as well. So genes that produce proteins involved in appetite control are candidates for the etiology of eating disorders. So what that means is they're looking at the genes that produce different chemicals, hormones, proteins that affect our appetite, such as leptin, which suppresses the appetite, or neuropeptide Y, which increases the appetite. But looking at variations of those genes, so variant alleles of those particular genes, those are great places for us to start to look at in terms of a genetic cause. Now, some examples are anorexia nervosa. This is demonstrated by the picture here with this young lady. And this one does have the highest risk of death for all of the eating disorders. Now, again, these have environmental versions and genetic versions. Now, what it is, it does usually affect females more than males, but it can affect both sexes. And what happens is no matter how small someone views themselves, no matter how small someone is, how skinny and thin they are, they always perceive themselves as being too big, too fat, too large. And again, that can be an environmental component. It could be someone is bullied their entire life, being told that they're ugly, they're a cow, or anything like that. Constantly seeing images of, super duper thin, beautiful models or actresses, that can affect them as well. But as that can affect them, that can lead them to think they're not good enough and thus lead to an eating disorder. However, that's not the only way that this can occur. Again, there can be a genetic predisposition or a genetic component, and then what happens is they actually do perceive themselves. When they look in the mirror, they do see themselves more so as large. So they actually have a perception of themselves that is different from everyone else around them. So here are some examples of a woman that had anorexia. So here she is. And now this is what she looked like when she was going through anorexia. And you can see how she is skin and bones. Even her muscles have wasted away. And because of this is actually why it's so dangerous and why it has the highest death rate, because by wasting away all the muscles and fat, you're actually going to cause damage to your organs and your organ systems. So they don't have the strong tissue that they need to run your body or to fix themselves. Or to fix themselves if they get damaged, but they also can't support the organism, in this case, this woman. So it does lead to a lot of health issues, more so than some of the other ones, and a lot of organ failure. The other one we want to talk about is muscle dysmorphia, which again does occur more so in men, but it can happen in women. So I'm trying to avoid the light. Yeah, we'll just rotate this way a little bit. There we go. That'll work. So this is kind of the opposite. Instead of always viewing themselves as fat or too large, what happens is that the man sees himself as too small. So that's this bottom picture here on the right. No matter how muscular and bulked out and how large his biceps and all his muscles are, when he looks in the mirror, he perceives himself as being too small. He sees himself as scrawny and a weakling and not desirable. So, because of this perception that he has of himself, it leads him to go to the gym more often. I'm not just talking about, like a couple trips a week. I'm talking about spending hours there every day just to bulk up. But no matter how big he gets, he always views himself as too small. Just like with someone with anorexia, no matter how thin and tiny they get, they always view themselves as too large. It's a perception. How they actually perceive, how they view themselves is what needs to be changed. And again, if this is a genetic condition, not the purely environmental one, if it's the genetic version, it's really hard to change that perception because it's ingrained in them. So here are some examples of guys with muscle dysmorphia, and you can see how large those muscles are. Sorry, to me, that is not attractive, but I mean, that's just so much muscle that doesn't look comfortable to me. Anyways, I digress. Now, if you kind of want to know what this is like, I would recommend checking this out. There is an episode of Family Guy where the dad, sorry, not Family Guy, is by the Family Guy creator, but there's an episode of American Dad where the dad, Stan, actually has anorexia nervosa. And for the first part of the episode, you see Stan through his own eyes, which is this. This is how he views himself. To him, he failed and couldn't run the FBI obstacle course because he was out of breath because he was too fat. But what we find out later is that's just his perception of him, and this causes him to stop eating. But this is how everyone else sees him right here. Everyone else, his family, his coworkers, see him as this skin and bones person. The reason why he couldn't do the obstacle course is because since he's not eating enough, he can't power his muscles and his cells, and he just had zero energy in order to do the course. So I did find that episode on YouTube if you are interested. It is a really powerful episode because it shows you the change in perception. It shows you Stan's perception, how he views himself. Every time he looks in the mirror, what does he see? How does he feel he is versus how everyone else perceives him? All right. Let's start talking about some sleep disorders then. So narcolepsy. So first off, before we start with that, we do know that there are quite a few genes that influence sleep, that affect our sleep and our ability to sleep and all that. However, we don't quite know why sleep is important, why it is necessary. I mean, there's lots of ideas of what happens when we sleep. Our our mind can kind of go back through the day and categorize. It can refresh itself, kind of like when you restart a computer. But they're not really quite sure what it is about sleep and not just resting that is different, why it is necessary, why we need sleep, in other words. If you go for too long without sleep, you start to have some neurological effects. You start to hallucinate and things of that nature, and maybe hear voices, and then your body starts to break down. Your organs actually can stop working, and then you can die if you go without sleep for too long. But we don't really know why it's necessary. We're still kind of figuring out the exact reason. Like I said, we have some ideas, we have some hypotheses, and we know kind of what goes on a physiological level, how the body kind of refreshes itself and how it restarts the brain. But we don't know why it needs sleep to do that versus just like resting. One of the most well-known sleep disorders is narcolepsy. Now, narcolepsy is a lifelong sleep disorder, meaning that once you have it, it will go on forever for the rest of your life. And it makes you feel overwhelmingly tired. And I'm not just talking about, oh man, it's been a long day, I'm exhausted. I am talking about, imagine you spent all day working out at the gym, and then you ran a marathon, and then you didn't fall asleep that night. Now imagine feeling that way all the time. So it's just this overwhelming, tired feeling. And sometimes in certain cases, or a particular type of narcolepsy, it can have uncontrollable sleep attacks. We call this cataplexy. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Narcolepsy is prevalent in some families. So the fact that we see it traveling through families does tell us that there is likely to be a genetic cause. But at least in dogs, we have found that it's due to an autosomal recessive gene. So we have also studied narcolepsy in dogs. Yes, dogs can experience narcolepsy too. And what they found is by studying the dogs, that it's related to an autosomal recessive gene. So it's not sex linked, and at least it's recessive. So you have to have both copies of it in order to have the effects of it. Now, there are two types of narcolepsy, type 1 and type 2. A lot of times when people talk about narcolepsy, then type 1 is the one that comes to mind first. So type 1 involves a combination of excessive daytime sleepiness, that's that overwhelming tired that we talked about, and it can be one or both of the following. First thing that can happen is something called cataplexy. So cataplexy is that sudden sleep attack that we mentioned, the uncontrollable sleep attack. So it causes a sudden loss of muscle tone while you are awake. It may lead to slurred speech and buckling knees, or in more severe cases, complete paralysis. These events are usually triggered by strong emotions such as joy, surprise, laughter, or anger. So what we mean by that doesn't mean that you become paralyzed. What we're talking about is, if you look at the picture at the bottom, here we have a child. He experiences some kind of strong emotional trigger, whether it is super duper happiness, joy, anger, whatever. Something very, very strong, a strong emotional trigger. And what that does is it affects his mind so that it goes into this cataplexy state. And loss of muscle tone means that his muscles, they start to relax. So a lot of times slump to the floor and fall asleep for a few minutes. Then he'll wake up just fine and continue on doing what he was doing. Another common symptom is low levels or absent CSF hypocretin. Hypocretin 1. So this is a particular hormone, and this is what will help to regulate, or what we found, it regulates awakeness, appetite, so it does affect appetite, and arousal. Now in someone with narcolepsy 1, we find that a lot of the time there's a deficiency in this particular hypocretin hormone. So the lower levels or the completely absent levels, that's why it affects the wakefulness, because it's hard to stay awake if you don't have this particular hormone that keeps you awake. I mentioned studies in dogs. Here are some Doberman Pinscher puppies, and I think they are totally adorable. But these are pictures taken during a study. Now the puppies were playing, just like puppies do. They're having fun, but like puppies do, they get excited and super happy when they play, and all of them passed out. They all just went to sleep for a few minutes. You can even see here in the black and white photo how one of them's, their mouth is over the other one, because they were mid-play when they all collapsed and fell asleep. They woke up a few minutes later and just experienced their play or continued playing like normal. That's what's going on with these cases. In these cases, the puppies, they reach that excitement level, the high emotional trigger that caused all of them to go into a cataplexy attack. I don't know if it's cataplexy attack, cataplectic attack, but anyways, they experienced cataplexy. So they all fell asleep. Woke up a few minutes later, no harm. They continued playing just like normal. Here's a really cute little comic to also kind of symbolize or describe it. You have the cute little doggy running after the butterfly, jumping. He's getting so excited chasing the butterfly. Has an episode of cataplexy, falls asleep, wakes up, continues chasing the butterfly. Excitement levels get really high again, triggers cataplexy, falls asleep again. I do think the dogs are super cute. All right. And then there's type 2 narcolepsy. Now again, most of the time when we talk about narcolepsy, type 1 with the cataplexy is what most people think of. Type 2 isn't as well known, but it is just as common. So this one occurs when you have that continuous excessive daytime sleepiness. The only difference is that there is no cataplexy. Now, a lot of times someone with this is recommended that they take multiple naps. You actually could take a couple hour naps and wake up feeling refreshed, but not long after you wake up, you feel extremely tired again. No matter how much sleep you get overnight, you still end up feeling tired again. You can actually wake up feeling completely exhausted. Let's see. Sorry. Now it's the daytime sleepiness, the excessive daytime sleepiness, as well as the REM cycles of sleep that help to determine if you have type 2 narcolepsy. What I mean by that is if you look at the bottom picture here, someone who does not have narcolepsy, who has no sleeping disorders, it usually takes them on average, or usually roughly about 1 hour to go from the moment they fall asleep to reach the REM cycle. However, someone with narcolepsy, including type 2 narcolepsy, it occurs in a matter of minutes. And they can determine this by doing a sleep study, where they have you go to a sleep clinic, and first they'll probably do an overnight sleep study, have you all hooked up to different electrodes and whatnot to determine if you have type 1 narcolepsy or if you have sleep apnea or anything like that. And then they'll have you stay the next day and have you, like every 2 hours, take a half an hour nap. In that time, you shouldn't be able to reach REM cycle or the REM cycle at all. And if you do, it's not going to be until the very end, right when you're about to wake up. But what they found is people with type 2 narcolepsy, as soon as they close their eyes, they actually, within a few minutes, they reach that REM cycle. So that's one of the big indicators of whether or not you have type 2 narcolepsy. All right. And our last topic for this slide is FASPS, F-A-S-P-S, also known as Familial Advanced Sleep Phase Syndrome. You can see why we call it FASPS. Now what this is I'm sure you guys have heard of the term a biological clock. So what that means is that there's, when your body gets on a certain schedule, maybe if you spend your whole life waking up to an alarm at 7 a.m. and then, sorry again, trying to get out of the lights. You get up at 7 a.m. with an alarm. At some point, you actually stop needing the alarm because your body just has gotten used to it. It adds that to its routine, and you can wake up at 7 a.m. even without an alarm. That's kind of what we mean by biological clock. How your body will do things on its own schedule based on, how you've trained it. But what they've also found is that there are certain cases where the body may not be trained, it automatically works on a certain schedule. And that's what FAST is. So what this means is that it'll make people, what happens is people with FAST will fall asleep at the same time, roughly every night, and wake up each day at the same time. They've been looking at this and studying a family in Utah that have FAST. And what they found is that the family falls asleep around 7:30 every night. Now, is it exactly at 7:30? Could be 7:32, 7:25, but it's going to be around that time frame. Not long before that, they start to feel that incredible tiredness and they know they're going to fall asleep. So it's like, why not go to bed? On the same token, they always wake up around 4:30 a.m. every day. And it's not one of those, you wake up, you go to the bathroom, you go back to sleep. No, they wake up and they are awake. They are alert. Their mind is ready to get going. And this occurs every day. Now, as we said, this is kind of some of the first evidence to show that there is an actual biological clock in humans, that there could be some kind of genetic control that determines our circadian rhythm, our cycles of day versus night. Now, by studying this family, they have found a particular gene that could affect this. They call it the period 1 gene, and it's located near the tip of the long arm of chromosome 2. So the long arm is the bottom arm. So kind of near the bottom of chromosome 2, that's where they found this period 1 gene, and they think this could be a good candidate for a gene that affects our sleep-wake cycle. They have found this or similar versions of this gene, so counterparts of the period 1 gene in other species as well. You've noticed that there are other species that have particular wake and sleep cycles, and they believe that it could be due to counterparts of this period 1 gene. All right, let's see. So this is just kind of showing you a little bit about what it would be like. So we have general population means someone without FAST or without narcolepsy. So let's say this is the time they go to bed. Take some time for sleep to actually occur. First slow wave, first REM cycle, body temperature, and then offset means you wake up. Now this can change. People can go to bed at different times. They can wake up at different times. But someone with FAST, it's a little bit different. They generally always go to bed around the same time because the wave of sleepiness, the tiredness, hits them at a certain time before then. They start getting really, really tired, hardly able to keep their eyes open. Makes sense to go to bed. Sleep onset, first slow wave, first REM cycle, and then waking up at the same time. Now, if you're wondering what melatonin is, it actually is a natural hormone that helps promote sleep. Yes, you can buy it in the vitamin aisle, but your body also does make it normally. And what they found is that now temperature of the air tends to go down at certain times. It's usually warmer during the day, cooler at night. And what they found is that as the temperature starts to go down, it triggers the melatonin levels to start rising. So the daytime temperature dropping naturally in the evening. Now, again, that occurs when the sun goes down. So no matter where you're at, you're going to see a change in temperature from day to night. And whenever that day to night temperature change occurs, they also notice that there is a spike in melatonin. That's the sleep hormone. the one that makes us tired and sleepy and ready to go to bed. And it stays high so long as the temperature is low. Then as the sun starts to come up and the ambient temperature is warming up, we see the melatonin levels drop, which allows the person to wake up. All right, so that's fast. And that is all of session 1 and session 2. So I hope this was informative. I hope it helped you out. If you have questions, hit me up in our Google Classroom or email. Sorry. Oh. I will put the link for this presentation in the video description. So if you want to check out that episode of American Dad, you can. Like I said, I do think it's a good episode because it shows the different perceptions that people experience. But yeah, otherwise, stay awesome, stay curious, and most importantly, you guys, stay safe and healthy. All right, you guys, take care of yourselves. There we go. All right, you guys. Bye-bye.